in this video, we'll be talking about concepts of illness and wellness in the modern world, looking at the ways in which the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the origins of science-based medicine in the 19th century reshaped concepts of healing in the modern West. So let's start with the 16th and 17th centuries with the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution describes the emergence of new ideas and a new framework in the 16th and 17th centuries that created a shift in worldview. It was one of the key developments in the evolution of Western society and gave rise to modern concepts of science based on the scientific method. The scientific method is rooted in the idea that knowledge is best constructed through observation, experimentation, and clear and logical deduction. This method would come to transform all branches of science and a variety of disciplines, like medicine, that were rooted in science. The big takeaway from the scientific revolution, the big transformation from the scientific revolution, was the creation of what historians have referred to as the Newtonian worldview. And the Newtonian worldview is a new belief that emerged in modern Europe that the world operated according to natural principles. This means that the universe didn't operate according to the interventions of a deity or magic, but rather the idea that it operated according to a set of natural laws. Those laws were universal, they were constant, and they could therefore be studied and understood. This belief in natural law would be applied to medicine, and combined with the Renaissance emphasis on knowledge of anatomy, which became particularly important for art, it led to a new focus on understanding the human body and the way it functioned from the perspective of natural law. So for example, in 1543, a man named Andreas Vesalius wrote on the structure of the human body, becoming one of the first scientists to use systematic dissection to study the human body. He was the first person to describe the skeleton as providing the structure for the human body and identifying the heart as an organ that pumped blood. Vesalius is often referred to as the father of anatomy. His work was picked up by William Harvey, who became the first to describe the circulation of blood. He became the first to describe the circulatory system. And Paracelsus, who recognized the impact, both positive and negative, or both beneficial and detrimental, that substances could have on the human body. Paracelsus is understood as the father of toxicology and medical chemistry. So what you see in the scientific revolution is improved understanding of the human body, aided by dissection and instruments like the microscope, and filtered into a worldview that focused on natural laws. So there were a number of advances in the early modern period, at least in terms of book learning, because many of these medical advances were more impressive on paper than they were in practice. In the period after the scientific revolution, as Europe moves into what becomes known as the Enlightenment, mortality rates were still very high. In fact, they soared thanks to warfare, epidemic diseases, the emergence of urbanism, where people are shifting more and more to densely populated cities, and a lack of understanding of sanitation and sterilization. So medicine had a difficult time translating scientific advances into clinical success. There were several problems that continued to face European medicine or Western medicine in the 18th century, including a sort of loose amalgam of medical practitioners. There were still a variety of practitioners, different categories of healers, high and low medicine, who were only loosely controlled and free from significant oversight. Medical practitioners in the 18th century included faith healers, pharmacists, physicians, surgeons, midwives, white witches. There were a variety of people who claimed to be able to help people heal themselves from illness. But few treatments by any of these practitioners, whether high or low, were actually effective. So one of the problems faced by 18th century medicine was this loose assortment that we could define as the early medical profession. There were also diagnostic limitations. Diagnosis was the art of observation with the eyes and inference with the mind. It was largely based on a patient's narrative, and this was the story that the patient told of the illness that they were experiencing. So what happened in the early modern world was that a physician or a healer of any sort would listen to the patient's description of their illness, observe them externally, and then make a decision about how best to treat that illness, generally still based on the concept of the humors. New techniques like auscultation, which was percussion on the chest to check for pulmonary disease, were largely ignored. They were regarded with suspicion. In the 18th century, there was still generally a lack of understanding of what caused disease. There was a huge debate between a group known as the Miasmatists, and the Miasmatists believed in miasmas, which said that disease was the result of bad air. So environment was the cause. And Contagionists, who believed that disease was spread by infected material. Both of these groups had elements of truth, but neither completely understood what would become known as the germ theory of disease. So there was a lack of sanitation, a lack of sterilization, that made hospitals and other medical institutions basically spreaders of disease rather than healers of disease. There were some advances and improvements in the Enlightenment. Diderot's critique of hospital conditions, for example, led to some improvements in cleanliness and ventilation. And at the end of the 18th century, there was experimentation with inoculation, which led eventually to the emergence of variolation and vaccination. So you have the first successful vaccines, in this case against smallpox, developed by Edward Jenner in the 1790s. But it wasn't until the 19th century that modern medicine, as we sort of recognize it today, began to take shape in the West. And there were a few key elements involved in the emergence of modern medicine in the 19th century. The first was the origin or the emergence of professionalism. This was a reorganization of the profession as nations across Europe began to develop institutions to govern and oversee the practice of medicine. This began in France as they systematized and formalized education. Education became more scientific, and more importantly, it became clinical. You see in Paris the emergence of what became known as the clinical school, where education often took place at the bedside. Medical students went into hospitals, interacted with patients, learned from doctors as they practiced. This was a hands-on approach to education, with an emphasis on careful diagnosis and knowledge of the practical arts as well as the theoretical understanding of science. France also created new licensing guidelines and created institutional bodies that oversaw medical practice. The second key advancement in the 19th century is known as the lab revolution, and it developed in Germany. In the lab revolution, doctors began to apply the scientific method to medicine. They began to experiment with medical science. It was within this context that a huge turning point in modern medicine developed. And this was the germ theory of disease. The germ theory of disease was the work of several doctors over the course of the last half of the 19th century. And what they described, or what they proved, was that disease is caused by microorganisms, organisms so small that they can only be seen with the microscope, and that they can be transmitted from person to person through infected material. This was suggested by John Snow in the 1854 cholera epidemic in London, and proven through a series of experiments by Louis Pasteur between 1860 and 1864. This understanding of disease and the importance of sanitation and sterilization in medical practice proved to be transformative in improving medical outcomes in the 20th century. The third key development in the 19th century that would contribute to modern medicine were new instruments. These were instruments like the stethoscope, new instruments for measuring temperature, blood pressure, pulse rates. These were instruments that opened up the human body for closer observation, for better diagnostic decisions. They connected medical science and diagnostics to create something that medical historians call the medical gaze. The medical gaze is how doctors interpret a patient's story, the story of their illness, what they're experiencing. How doctors translate that story into a diagnosis in biomedical terms, what is causing the disease. Overall, these changes improved professionalism, the lab revolution, and new instruments creating or allowing for the medical gaze, improved medical outcomes as we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, but also created a new medical paradigm in which power in the medical relationship shifted from the patient to the doctor, and that would define 20th century medicine. Thank you.